Donald Trump, preparing to visit both Israel and Saudi Arabia, will be taking an in-depth look at the U.S.'s policy in the strife-torn Middle East. And in our continuing series of the Belt and Road's Heartbeats, I'll be talking to a South African entrepreneur who has been working in China for the past 15 years, advising clients on global procurement. Welcome to The Point. I'm Li Xin. President Trump will shortly be making his first overseas trip since taking office. He will be visiting Israel, the Vatican and Saudi Arabia before attending a NATO meeting in Belgium and a Group of Seven summit in Italy. The choice of Israel and Saudi Arabia has drawn particular attention as the two are traditional enemies but are also both allies of the United States. To help us understand the potential change and continuity of his policies with regard to those of Trump's predecessor, I talked to John Feiner, resident fellow of the Institute of Politics at Harvard University, who was in Beijing attending a seminar on China and the United States in the Middle East. I started by asking him about the opportunities for cooperation the US and China can have with regard to that region.
There is already a track record of some cooperation between China and the United States to solve a big problem in the Middle East, and that's the Iran nuclear threat. So obviously both China and the United States participated in the P5+1 negotiations, worked very closely together, and were able, with the help of other countries and other partners, to address and resolve that issue peacefully without any conflict and any war. And China's role in the Iran nuclear deal is critical, especially with regard to the Arak nuclear reactor in Iran. Whether they can extend that cooperation to other issues, I think, remains to be seen. As you said, the Belt and Road Initiative may actually offer an opportunity for the United States and China, or at least for American companies and China, to work to address some of the infrastructure needs of the region. And I would encourage the United States not to look too skeptically or with too much suspicion of Belt and Road, and actually to see it as a potential opportunity for the United States.
A fair point. Now, for the U.S.'s policy in the Middle East, where do you see President Trump going? We have seen back and forth, for instance, on the question of the one-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Now he seems to have, again, stepped back, but he seems to want to make peace in that region. Where is his policy going from what we have seen so far?
So what I think we see so far is more continuity than we might expect in a few areas. On counterterrorism, Trump was quite critical of President Obama's approach to the ISIS problem in the Middle East. He ordered a new strategy, a new review, and his administration gave him back a strategy that looked very much like the approach that President Obama was taking, so a lot of continuity there. On Iran, President Trump, when he was a candidate, was quite critical, as you know, of the Iran nuclear deal, but so far he has signaled his intention to remain in the deal, and the State Department has certified that Iran is complying with the deal. Even on Israel and Palestine, which you just remarked on, I think so far there has been a higher degree of continuity from President Trump than we might have expected. He has been critical of the Israelis on settlement construction, and he has welcomed Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to Washington just in recent days. So I think in terms of what they're doing, there's a lot of continuity. In terms of what they're saying, I think you're seeing a high degree of really aggressive rhetoric, and sometimes descriptions of the policy from different senior officials that differ from what the president says. And so I think the concern that some of us have is a lack of clarity, a lack of coherence as to their policy approach.
You're working under former Secretary of State John Kerry, especially during the deal that the United States struck with Russia in dealing with Syria's chemical weapons issue. Do you think there will be this kind of red line being drawn again under President Trump when it comes to any possible strong action in response to Syria or the Syrian government's any future possible use of chemical weapons?
Well, I mentioned earlier that there has been some areas of continuity where we thought there might be change. There have also been some change where we might have expected continuity from the new administration, and Syria is a good example. President Trump signaled during the campaign that he was not supportive of increased U.S. military activity in the Middle East, that he thought the Iraq war was a bad idea, even though at the time he had supported it, and that he would not get the United States involved more deeply in military military conflicts. But as
he did drop the 59 Scud missiles in Syria.
So that was during the campaign. As president, President Trump has actually taken significant steps towards greater U.S. military involvement in the region. The best example, as you indicated, is the missile attack on the Assad regime in response to the use of chemical weapons. But he has also increased U.S. military activity in Iraq, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and even in places like Somalia. So there are some examples here of increased military activity where we might have thought the administration would not intervene as much as they have.
Let's come back to Syria,
Sure.
because again, we have this meeting that's being held by Russia, by Iran, and by Turkey, where they even signed an agreement to set up kind of a de-escalation zone in Syria. How does the United States look at this development now?
Well, it's interesting. The United States was present at this meeting, but was not a direct participant in this meeting. Its status was that of an observer to the agreement. So I think the American government is still sort of studying the agreement to determine what exactly it says and whether it is a viable approach. My concern is that it is hard to imagine an agreement that can be implemented effectively that doesn't involve the United States, and frankly, it doesn't involve some other countries that are involved in this conflict, particularly the Gulf countries, which provide a high degree of support to the Syrian opposition. I welcome Russian, Turkish, and Iranian leadership in trying to address what is the worst crisis anywhere on the planet, the worst humanitarian crisis and the worst conflict. But I do think it is going to require buy-in from other countries, including the United States, to make this work. There have been a lot of agreements on Syria, and not a lot of them have been successful.
No, and maybe that's precisely the reason why the United States is not involved. I mean, the last time the United States and Russia struck some kind of an agreement, and it again fell through. But how do you think would be a reasonable stepping stone for the United States to come back into the negotiating table, not as an observer? What would have to happen?
Well, one thing I think that would have to happen is for the new administration, the Trump administration, to prioritize ending the Syrian conflict as a policy priority. So far, if you chalked up the administration's policy priorities in Syria, you would have to say that they are focused exclusively on ISIS and on defeating ISIS. That was President Obama's policy and priority as well. But President Obama also focused a lot of time, energy, and attention, and Secretary Kerry in particular focused a lot of time and energy on addressing the underlying conflict. My sense is that you cannot defeat ISIS over the long run as long as the underlying Syrian civil war continues to rage, and it would be good if the Trump administration, Secretary Tillerson, and President Trump started to prioritize ending that war as well.
Do you think President Trump would one day accept the fate of President Assad as the new and the continuous leader of Syria, if there is peace?
Well, we'll have to see. The new administration has said a lot of things about President Assad. At one point, they seemed to indicate they saw no possibility for him to depart. Pretty soon after the chemical weapons attack, they started to say some pretty strong, pretty negative things about President Assad. So I think that this is one of those areas in which a greater degree of clarity as to what the new administration's position is would be helpful to those of us trying to interpret it, as well as to the parties trying to end the conflict.
What is the current state of the U.S. foreign policy bureaucracy, let's say the State Department? We have all these voices of dissent, which probably by now has already been channeled properly, but there is also this lack of personnel and the slashing of funding that we have heard talking about. Is that going to affect the U.S.'s foreign policy and also the implementation of the policy in the future?
I think it will affect American foreign policy. What you're seeing is a new administration that seems to value and prioritize military advice and the use of military power as a tool in making foreign policy. President Trump has said, I'm going to give a lot of deference, a lot of autonomy to my military commanders, and he has surrounded himself with a lot of advisors who have a military background or who are current military officers. On the other side of the coin, diplomacy and development have gotten a shorter shrift from the new administration. He has not empowered his diplomats, and in fact, he has left a number of very important senior positions unfilled at the State Department. I think that is unfortunate. I think that is going to make diplomatic follow-up to some of the positions he is taking and some of the policies he wants to pursue very difficult if you don't have the personnel in place to do that hard work.
Finally, you also worked very extensively as a journalist, and you've written a lot of front-page stories. How do you look at the kind of relationship between the press, especially between the liberal press, with the with President Trump at this moment? Is that conducive? I mean, we see this fighting, this quarreling almost on a daily basis on some of the TV stations.
Well, I think it's important to point out we have a very free and vigorous press in the United States that has, on many occasions, I think, angered the president by some of its reports, and I suspect it will continue to hold the administration.
And vice versa, the president has also angered some of the
Absolutely, and I think the press will continue to hold the new administration accountable for its statements and for its policies as well it should. I personally have found discouraging, and I think a number of reporters and people who care about journalism and press in the country have found discouraging some of the statements made by the president about the role of the press. That said, the president is a pretty savvy operator. On the one hand, he may be criticizing reporters. On the other hand, he is bringing them in to his confidence and providing interviews and that sort of thing. I think the most important thing to underscore is that a free and vigorous press is essential to the functioning of American society, and I would argue other societies, and that is going to continue.
Thank you very much, John Feiner, resident fellow with the Institute of Politics with Harvard University.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. John Feiner's last sentence led me thinking about whether the level of freedom people enjoy is enough or too much or too little. I think any discussion on this complex subject should take account of whether greater freedom of speech has helped people understand each other better and build the kind of consensus necessary for the society to develop, instead of creating an atmosphere where you're just constantly debating. For instance, the United Kingdom is very proud of its freedom of speech, and yet, because everyone has a right to express their point of view, it took a full 20 years from the start of planning of Terminal 5 at Heathrow Airport to its completion. Can anyone really argue that the country was better served by that 2 decades of delay? We in the developing world, with the largest number of mouths to feed, really do not have that kind of luxury. And I want to make this clear, contrary to what many people believe, you might be surprised to see the variety of opinions being expressed on social platforms in China. So I would say, although what we have is not perfect, it has created an economic miracle. And for a divided society like that of the United States, maybe they could learn a thing or two from us. Kubas, thank you very much for joining us today. First of all, tell us a little bit about your experience here in China.
So I've been in China a long time. It's 15 years now, and I'm the founder of the Beijing Axis. And in 2002, moved to China, sat in Tiananmen Square, first on the steps of the Great Hall of the People, until the guards ushered me away and I walked across to the museum and worked on the business plan for what is today the Beijing Axis. The last 15 years has been absolutely phenomenal. I still feel as if I'm a student of China in every sense of the word. It is so rich, it is so profound to see this transition and this transformation, and I feel really honored to have been part of it. It's really the wink of an eye. You know, 15 years has never gone so quickly. Sure. But traveling in different regions, I think I've been to every province in China except one, and I hope to fill that in, and having a very good time.
And the latest course is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. Everybody is talking about that since the past 3 years or so. What do you find interesting about this initiative, and what do you find challenging or slightly confusing, maybe?
Well, I think it's still early days, you know, even though it's been 3-4 years. But I must say, over the last 1 year, I started to take note of Belt and Road.
Why only since last year?
Initially, having now been in China for a while, I've seen things like, you know, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I've seen the New Development Bank or BRICS Bank. I've seen FOCAC. I've seen SEO, you know, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on and so forth. And I know they always develop over time. Initially, it was not clear to me personally how this would develop and where it would go. But
what changed?
I think just the inclusiveness of it. The energy, the thinking behind it, the thrust from the highest levels of government in China, firstly, but the buy-in from around the world. And, I see it as very geographic. It has this overland economic belt, and it has the maritime sea route aspect to it. But it's gone far beyond that. If you go back and you look at history, it's kind of defined what was included in ancient times in this. But now, we're seeing vast parts of East Africa pulled in, the further south areas of Southeast Asia, far west of Europe. And even I saw a headline recently, with engagement in the Americas. So I think it is becoming a very important framework for development and for many initiatives. And I think, therefore, I had to take note and ask myself, and we ask ourselves, what does it mean for us?
As an entrepreneur, how have you come to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, well, firstly, we have our existing strategy, that we update on a regular basis. And we've been expanding into India, we've been expanding into Southeast Asia. China, in a way, at the core of the strategy. We're also, of course, in Africa. But what we've seen now is that there are some specific developments around synchronizing policy, infrastructure and capacity and connectivity, trade, investment, people-to-people exchanges at the heart of Belt and Road Initiative that come into these regions that I've mentioned. And we need to take cognizance of that and say, how do we look at our global procurement business differently? How do we look at our international sales activation business differently? And then on the advisory side, we do transaction advisory and strategic advisory. How do we look at that differently, given these capital flows, trade flows, people flows, needs for strategic intelligence that will now arise because of Belt and Road? And we've seen a huge overlap. If anything, Belt and Road reinforces our earlier views on what is our value to add in our chosen markets and how do we position. So it really just adds excitement for us. We may have to adjust, open offices more quickly in certain countries or partner differently. And we are very actively looking at all of that. But at this stage, I think it's a big positive for us. We see it as a huge opportunity because so many countries, businesses, pieces of global value chains are coming together, and there are many questions. And we're in that business. We solve business problems in those procurement, sales activation, advisory areas. So it's very exciting.
Over the past 3 years, have you seen the kind of interest by foreign enterprises increasing about the Belt and Road Initiative or about doing business with China or attracting Chinese investment as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Look, I think so, especially more recently. I would, again, as I told you earlier, my interest really started to peak in the last 1 year to 18 months. Earlier than that, I think it was still a tentative interest on my part, and I see that mirrored in how business associates, partners, commentators that we interact with have looked at it. That's all different now. Everyone is taking a step closer. There's the upcoming summit. People are very interested to see how that goes down. And then the specific sub-initiatives that will come out of that, and how that can become practical for them. So definitely, I think the groundswell that I mentioned is clearer, and people are becoming more strategic about that and mobilizing resources. Once that happens, you need to know you're already late if you are not moving, because I think things will accelerate.
Sure.
And then you need to be in place.
Yeah. There are different topics, let's say, of this summit. There are the connectivity, infrastructure, finance, policy connection, and also cultural exchanges, how to connect people. Which one or which ones will you be paying most attention to?
Perhaps at the core for me would be to talk about financing. That is often a bottleneck, and linking that to actionable projects. When you talk to financiers, they always talk about the limited projects available to invest in, as if that's really the headache. And if you talk to people with projects, they talk about, how do I access capital? And I think this is where you need to bring those people with the right thinking, ability to implement together with sources of capital and good projects. What is a good project? How to prioritize if you have more than one in a region, which region to put before the other. All of this needs to be done in a very practical way that is planned, where you have metrics that are defensible. You'll have disagreements. You need to then, bring that together, and all of this needs to move in a somewhat concerted manner. And we're in such an early stage here that a lot of that still clearly needs to be worked out. So I look more for that from this period in time and this summit, rather than achieving everything. I mean, I think it's probably in 5 and 10 years that we will really appreciate it, and even well beyond that, because in China, long-term always means something very different, right? It can mean really long-term.
Well, China has had a very intense cooperation with African countries much longer than the Belt and Road Initiative. And even then, since then, there has been all kinds of criticism of China's role or China's real intention from its African partners. And now this Belt and Road Initiative, how do you look at the kind of suspicion or accusation of China being another, how shall I say, trying to build a network like the imperialist countries in the past, trying to extract more natural resources and exchange and making use of the cheap labor for its own benefit, kind of a one-way process?
Yeah, look, I've heard a lot of this talk for many, many years, and I always get asked, is China a partner or a predator in Africa? And then I have to, give them the view. Africa has benefited greatly from China's growth and from China's investment, lending in Africa, from its, buying of raw materials and other products in Africa. So I think that's undisputed. But could Africa have benefited more? Yes, I can see different scenarios. So then you start to debate this, and people say it's one or the other. I think globalization is inevitable. I think, all these pundits and proponents of the end of globalization, I don't believe that. I think globalization will continue. I think, in fact, China is playing a key role in underscoring and underpinning that. But China's engagement globally is new. Of course, there's the ancient times, but if you really think of it, from 2002, when we started as a business, until now, we've seen overseas foreign direct investment go from less than $1 billion a year to more than $200 billion last year. So some lessons have been learned, some things have been done for the first time. So that for me is the departure point. Meanwhile, I think all countries, China, the United States, countries in Europe, they act with self-interest. That's natural, that's normal, that should be understood and expected. The question is, can that be achieved, acting with self-interest while you're also doing something where the rest of the international community or a region benefit? And I see no real conflict at this point with Belt and Road Initiative or FOCAC and China's engagement in Africa as it not having benefit for these different regions. Of course, we live in a world with suspicion and fear, and we've seen world wars and we've seen conflicts. So I think that's also natural. Although it's 30, 40 years now that China has shifted so much, it's still only a very short space of time. If we think back 20 years of G7, the US, Russia, the Cold War, and G7 concepts like that, now China is there. It's a very different world, and for analysts, commentators, politicians, leaders, it's a shock to the system. I think we will get used to this. Again, sometimes there will be some mistakes made, and then it's a question of how do you correct, self-correct, and sometimes you need to be nudged to see a different perspective. So I'm comfortable with the fact that the engagement in Africa is adding a huge amount of value to the continent. Africa must also make sure that it defines how it wants to engage with the world, and in this case, China, and similarly for Belt and Road. If these countries can organize as countries and as regions, they stand to benefit hugely. Will China benefit along the way? Of course, for sure. Yeah. And its people will, its companies will, but perhaps its strategic, geostrategic objectives will too. And I don't think that there's any issue with that.
Finally, a story to wrap up. Any interesting story you could share with us?
Yeah, we bring hundreds of delegations from the world into China to do business, every year, and we help Chinese with delegations traveling globally in this, space that we're in. So there are many, many stories, but I can really only say that having seen this piece of history has been completely, transformative for me as a person, and I can't wait to see what lies ahead. I can tell you this: I came to China on my own, and now I have a family. I have a Chinese wife. Okay. I have Chinese parents. My mother and father in-law are Chinese, and so I can tell you, in terms of life stories, sitting around the dinner table, traveling around the country, seeing this story unfold is really a privilege and great fun.
And it looks like you will continue this in the future. This is only the beginning. This is only the beginning. Thank you very much, Kubas, for accepting our interview today.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on CGTN.